Let's have a look at the question of, is there an alternative to growth, or what about this growth myth? The first statement I want to put forward is that there cannot be infinite growth on a finite planet. So this might seem logic, but still it has not been really entered the broad understanding. So still growth is proposed by many politicians and economists as the solution out. So it seems there is a growth paradigm, or that there is a necessity to grow, which is unquestioned. Going into depth why that is like this would go maybe a bit too deep. And I will deal with this also in my lecture of Rethinking Economy a bit more. But for the time being, let us start from the assumption saying it is impossible to infinitively grow. The next level of thought could be saying, well, there could be growth, but without material use, so without environmental destruction. But unfortunately, recent studies, or all kind of studies, have actually shown that growth always comes along with an increased use of resources. If you want to know more about this, there is a really nice TED Talk. You can see the link on that slide, which I can highly recommend you to watch. And last but not least, one short statement to keep in mind is saying, always keep in mind that GDP growth has nothing to do with well-being. Also here, plenty of studies have been showing that the GDP growth is not having any correlation. Actually, for example, in the US, since the 1960s, GDP was growing continuously, but happiness was peaking in the 1960s. Also, you just have to think about that if someone has a car accident, or if more people need the help of insurance because a tornado was destroying their houses, all this would contribute to the GDP being, but not necessary to the well-being. So let us have a look at what are the alternative approaches. So we can say that there is like two broad ideologies out there on the topic of alternatives to growth. We have on the one hand the idea of degrowth, which was coined by French author Dalisa Latouche, who is proposing, saying we need to downscale our production, we need to downscale consumption. Only with an economic and societal system where we have less production and less consumption, we will be able to survive on that planet. In the same time, we should focus on increasing the well-being through social aspects. So because we produce less and because we consume less in the market sphere, we have more time in the community and with family, and this will increase our well-being because we will be closer ingrained in the social aspect. So he is pretty skeptical on capitalism, so his writing is really well, it's a statement, it's an ideology, so to say, no? And then we have these proponents of the idea of the steady state economy, or the steady state, a term which was coined by Herman Daly, which we dealt with in other chapters of this lecture, and taken forward by many authors, for example, Dietz and O'Neill, who made a study which I will quote in the next slides. So the steady state economy is basically saying, let's have a look at the biophysical aspects. Like, let's have a look at everything which is materialistic, which we can catch in alternative to this abstract money, because money is mainly in the computers. And let us have a look at some economical system where we say all the stocks and the flows are kind of stable, and where we act within the carrying capacity. So this is their statement. So they don't make any reference to the topic of GDP growth, which is actually growth which is detached from, which is only in the numbers, or any statements on the topic of capitalism. So they keep silent on that part, but saying that is the baseline. We should really look into environment for designing a new economy. So in the steady state economy, the conceptual framework they differentiate biophysical accounts on the one hand, which are mainly the means, and then the socioeconomic accounts, which can be considered the ends to an economy. And then in the biophysical accounts, they say there are some ultimate means, such as material, energy, and biocapacity, which are really ultimate means. And then we have intermediate means, which are already made from that means, such as the built capital or the population itself, which they count also there. And then socioeconomic accounts would be the intermediate ones, would be to say you have a meaningful work, you have a certain amount of leisure time, there is an equality, you have good governance, and so on. So, and then the ultimate end, and one could discuss if this is 1 or if these are 4, as we can see in there, would be to be satisfied in life and happy. If health is now an intermediate end or an ultimate end, I think this is a kind of philosophical discussion. But the basic idea is that we want to all achieve satisfaction and well-being in our lives. So they made kind of a reality check saying, what is the current status of the steady-state economies all over the planet? Are there steady-state economies? And if yes, how are they doing in terms of happiness? So they have created different kind of indicators. They have looked at the, let's say, amount of electricity used in a full country, or the number of material turnover, or the number of light bulbs lighted, or they have taken different indicators. And for both, for the biophysical and for the socioeconomic accounts, and then have been showing, has there been a correlation? Is there something which seems to come along with higher or lower stocks, with growth or non-growth? So for checking the stability of an economy, they have taken 7 indicators from the stocks and flows of the biophysical accounts. And if, for example, most of them were increasing, so they have compared to different, I think a difference of 10 years or so. And then if they were decreasing, then they would, more than 4 of them were decreasing, then they would call it a degrowth country. If 4 or 5 were stable or degrowing, at a partial degrowth country. If many of them were stable, a stable country, and if more of 4 of them were growing, they would call it a growth country. And we can see that the majority of countries, as well as the majority of people, are actually living at the moment in countries which can be where more than 4 indicators are growing. So where more light bulbs are used, where more electricity is turned over 10 years later. But still a quite considerable amount. Apparently, like 22 countries and 10% of the population already lives in countries which have a stable turnover of all their biophysical accounts in their definition. So the second aspect they looked into were saying, well, in how far is the materials which are used by that countries within the fair earth share? And we have come across that concept already when we talked about the ecological footprint. And a fair earth share is for them more or less when you have an ecological footprint of one planet, so that everyone could live in a similar manner and it would not exploit our global resources. So when they checked again all countries, they figured out 10% of our population lives in a country which is within the fair earth share, 38% live below their fair earth share, and a bit more than half live above the fair earth share, which is, I think we all had a gut feeling that that would be the global reality. So the operative definition of a steady state economy is now to say you have to have a biophysical account, which are like showing no change, and you have to operate within a fair earth share, so around one planet. In opposite, there is also the biophysical stable economy, which is defined by saying the biophysical accounts show no change, but you either are above or below your fair earth share. So these are the numbers now. So that's what they have figured out. We have in the left side, we can see the countries already grouped by degrowth, partial growth, stable, and partial growth. And then we have the different indicators they have been using for the stocks and the flows. So how many people, how much livestock has there been, how many light bulbs have there been, how much material, energy, CO2 has been used. And then we can see the list of, for example, Germany is apparently living in a degrowth country. I find that pretty interesting. And then we can see Austria on the lower part, for example, of this page, living clearly in a growth setting. So all these countries in the middle are a biophysical stable country. We can see that part here. And then they have taken those which have an air share around 1, which is in that case South Africa, North Korea, Kyrgyzstan, Colombia, and Cuba. And these are the 5 currently existing steady-state economies. So these are the only steady-state economies which deserve the name of being a steady state economy. So in the next step of that study, now they have known, okay, which are like on a biophysical level steady state. Let's look into the happiness and of the steady state and the growth. So we see here those countries which are in a steady state are those which are like close to the center over here, like we see Colombia over there. And then we have up here all the countries which are still growing, even though it's non-desirable. And then we have those which are still growing. It is desirable because the majority of their population lives below their fair earth share. And then these few countries which are at the moment in a degrowth state. And as you can see, it seems like not to make much difference. The happiness seems to be spread all over the place. So there seems to be, also in the first indication, not so much a connection between happiness and the growth. So there is no linear thing. And that's also what they figured out is the good news, saying biophysically stable economies have a higher life satisfaction, better health, greater equality, stronger democracy, and less poverty than growing economies. And finally, there is also no statistically significant relationship between biophysical growth and the unemployment rate, which is also a good news. Because I think all of us, or many of us, have learned that in their macroeconomic class, that we have to have growth to keep the unemployment rate low. But that seems to be not based on, or this evidence was not being able to prove. And stable stocks and flows seem to be related to stronger democratic institutions. I think this study hasn't shown what is causing what. So is it the democratic institutions causing the stable stocks or the other way around? In any case, this is a very clear empirical evidence against this argument that we have to have growth for a good life. So growth is not necessary to have life satisfaction, health, or anything else. Yet there is some bad news. The bad news was showing, if you compare like the fair earth share and happiness, unfortunately, and we can see that in all these graphics on the right side, there seems to be a clear relation between most of the happiness or the socioeconomic indicators with the air share which is used. So almost all indicators of well-being are higher the air share is, the country claims. And then the authors conclude, if all 7 billion people on Earth are to lead a good life within ecological limits, then we need to become much more efficient at translating resource use into human well-being. Yeah, so I hope that this small study gives you a certain insight on the myth of growth and why growth is necessary. And well, there is the study attached to this lecture also, so if you want to have more details, go ahead and have a look at it. I encourage you. Otherwise, you can go ahead and take the quiz.